Morning, everyone. How are we doing today? Here and on Zoom. Thanks for joining us at our first in-person breakfast event. So we're very excited about this. We do have a Zoom going online, but we're going to be hearing from a wonderful presenter today. So I want to start by thanking some of our sponsors. I'm going to start with Elhand, who provided us this wonderful space. And our key partner for the event, EDIC. We got a good group of them here today. We also have our other sponsors that I want to highlight. Brotherhood Credit Union, who often hosts our EDIC or our EDP and government affairs meetings at their Lynn branch. I see Bernadette on the phone. So Groom Construction is another one of our sponsors. I don't see Ed here today, but Clock Tower Business Associates, or Business Corporation, excuse me, is one of our sponsors for today's event. And our last sponsor, certainly not least, Deulis Brothers Construction and the co-chair of our Economic Development Committee, Patrick Deulis. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Colin. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. Glenn Morris, my co-chair, best. I'm sure he's probably trapped. So a few years ago, pre-COVID, the chamber sort of realigned some of its committees, and we merged a few of our standing committees and created what we call the Economic Development and Planning Committee. And we work closely with the city, with our friends over at EDIC, and we're targeting trying to bring business and economic activity into the city. And part of that is bringing people in who can inform us as to what is going on, beyond our borders, beyond the city. We have a great guest speaker today, and I apologize if I'm going to read his bio, but I did chat with him for a few minutes beforehand. Ben Forman, here from MassINC. And Ben is a research director, and MassINC, for those of you who don't know, is a think tank that uses research, civic journalism, and public forums to stimulate debate and shape public policy. Ben coordinates the MassINC's research agenda and oversees production of research reports. His work has been instrumental to the Gateway Cities policy agenda, including the creation of the Transformative Development Initiative at Mass Development. For those of you in the room and watching, we had a fellow from the TDI program, Joe Mulligan, who took up residence in the city for several years, looking at how we could sort of reshape downtown and stimulate business activity. And he worked closely with Jim Cowbell's group and I believe other municipal agencies. So his work is a direct result of the work that Ben's group. So in addition to his work at MassINC, it's also responsible for the neighborhood hub at Mass Housing and the Massachusetts Early College Initiative. Prior to joining MassINC, Ben was a researcher at Brookings Institute, with previous positions at the District of Columbia Department of Parks and Rec and International Economic Consulting for Nathan Associates. He also has experience in city government. That I want to give us.
Thank you, and good morning. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's my first time out of the house in 2 years. So we'll see how this goes. I'm used to the Zoom PowerPoints. This is my first one in real life, and I've also got a bunch of new research to show you this morning that I've never showed anybody before. So we'll see how it goes getting through all this. So for those of you who don't know, I can just share how MassINC works. We're a nonprofit. We were formed in 1996 to provide information decision makers and help improve the health of our democracy. We're nonpartisan. We have Republicans and Democrats on our board, and our funding comes from foundations, corporate sponsors, and individual donors. We don't have any government money. There's sort of three parts to our organization that somehow all work together. The Policy Center, which I lead, which also houses our Gateway Cities Innovation Institute. For over a decade now, we've been working with cities like Lynn together to help them collaboratively shape policy priorities that advance the state legislature. This actually came out of a report I did when I was at the Brookings Institute in the mid-2000s, looking at cities in Massachusetts outside of Boston and their needs in a changing economy. And after we put that report out, mayors came to us and said, we could really use your help because Boston has all the clout at the State House. And nobody listens to us, but if we work together, we'll have more impact. So that started the Gateway Cities movement, and we formed the Gateway Cities Institute to house all that work, because it really is advocacy oriented. Prior to that, we hadn't done any actual advocacy. We just done the research, put the reports out, and then whatever came of them off of nothing was the result. So we've been much more hands-on. We also have Commonwealth Magazine, which is nonprofit civic journalism. It used to be a quarterly print publication, but it is now an online daily resource and covers the State House, politics in Massachusetts, and civic life. And there's sort of a barrier between our advocacy work and our policy research and our journalism. We're separate. They have complete editorial independence so that they can be truly objective. And then lastly, we have the MassINC Polling Group, which is a for-profit subsidiary. They do lots of polling for private clients, and we really appreciate it when businesses reach out to them for public opinion research, because all the profits flow down to the think tank to help underwrite our work. Right now in 2022, we're working across a range of issue areas: education, housing, transportation, entrepreneurship, small business development, and then digital equity. I'm going to try and cover a little bit of each of these this morning. It's kind of a lot to unpack. I think I've left transportation out entirely. And all I'd say there, the focus of our work is trying to get rural affairs to a place where they actually make economic sense for folks who live in gateway cities, paying $300-400 a month on top of whatever the rent is nowadays. The math just doesn't work out for people. As a result, we're not getting the ridership we should be from that system and the economic development benefits that it could produce. So we've been working on that for a number of years. I think we've been heard. We haven't seen the change yet, but I think lots of folks in Lynn are working on that as well. And hopefully soon we'll adjust those fares more. What would be offered? So I'm going to spend most time this morning on education, because that really is the foundation of all. We've been spending a lot of time looking particularly at transitions from high school to post-secondary studies. And you can see here that in Massachusetts, low-income students, about 1 out of 5 is completing some sort of post-secondary degree, an associate's degree or more, compared to 56% of non-low-income students. So if you come from a household that has means, you're 2.5 times more likely to complete a post-secondary degree. If you look at, apples to apples comparison, students, for example, that have the same exact MCAT scores, you see this disparity is still very strong. Even at the 90th percentile, 95th percentile of the MCAS, you're looking at the most gifted students, and if you come from a family with means, you're still 20% points more likely to get a post-secondary degree. This is a huge problem for us going forward, because a larger share of our students come from low-income backgrounds, and much larger shares of our students are students of color today. And as you can see, students of color are half as likely for Hispanic students, only a third as likely as white students to complete a post-secondary degree. So,
Sorry to clarification. Post-secondary year, like master's degree.
No, associate. So a 2-year degree all the way up to professional, right? So just any sort of something between 65 and 70% of all jobs in Massachusetts today are asking for post-secondary training. Every decade we've been adding somewhere between 250 to up to 400,000 new workers with advanced training in Massachusetts. Over the next decade, projections show we're going to lose something like 200,000 college educated workers. We've never been in that environment before. We've always been dependent on growth and skilled workers. Some of that is because we have excellent public education systems, a little bit softer on public higher ed, which is part of the problem. But also, we've been importing tons of college educated workers internationally, and that has slowed down considerably, especially since the administration, and domestically from other states. And the flow has now reversed. So we've got to make more of our own in-house. And with the changing demographics, that's going to require doing business differently than we have been in Massachusetts. The recipe we've been working hardest on is the early college model, where students are introduced to the opportunity to go to college in 9th grade, if not earlier. They start to take college classes in 10th or 11th grade. They can earn lots of college credits. They have lots of advising and support, so they're not failing college classes. And so they're taking credits that count towards majors. All the evidence shows that that doubles the likelihood that a low-income student or student of color is going to complete a college degree and get into the workforce on a college career track. Lynn has been a great adopter of early college high school models. Last year it had 200 students in early college. This spring, I think the estimates are there's 500 Lynn students who are participating in early college. I think that's the strongest growth and one of the largest enrollment numbers in the entire state. The only city that even comes close to that right now is the city of Worcester. So there's really good work being done here. And I think, from a business standpoint, there's no question that that is a grow your own workforce strategy that could have real impact. The reason why we're seeing that growth is because the business community, Mass Business Alliance for Education, and a whole bunch of other states have been working and advocating for the legislature to support this model and to bring it to scale. Massachusetts has done a lot of interesting STEM, a lot of interesting career readiness things, but it's done them in 20s and 30s and 40s, which have no age. If we really want to move the needle, we're looking at something that 45,000 students should be in early college, within the next few years.
I was just going to say, having done a television show with Northshore Community College, they said they had 550 students in a designated college program, starting with an intro to careers in grade 9, English composition in grade 10, and then they divide out to 2 areas. One is information technology, the other is more of an intro to marketing or business program in grades 11 and 12. But I was floored with the level at grade 12, especially in the IT program. And the fact that it's totally a designated program, had to have very certain criteria that Governor Baker had set up.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly
it's amazing.
Right. And so every early college has been built around certain pathways. They're tailored to what the industry opportunities are in the community. A lot of programs start with 1 or 2, and then they add 3 or 4 or 5 health pathways, pathways. A lot of them have education pathways to try and grow their own educator workforce. So, but those pathways are only effective when the business community is integrally involved in offering internships, career exploration opportunities, so that kids can see at an early age that there's more they can be than a cop or firefighter. I mean, all good things. But there's lots of career opportunities that most kids in a lot of households have never heard of today. So early college programs are able to introduce those to students, get students in the coursework, so they have a taste for what it is they're going to need to be able to do to get the credentials required for those careers. So, sure. Yeah.
A quick question.
Yeah.
You mentioned a few minutes ago about the shift of educated workforce.
Yeah. I mean, I gotta figure it's cost of living.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, that's colleges in the world.
Yeah. Well, yeah, if you look back years ago, we were winning by huge amounts in the exchange of college educated workers, right? We had some domestic out-migration, but it was lower skilled workers who were leaving, not higher skilled workers. But it's in more recent years, the tables have turned on us. So anyhow, in terms of these line items in the state budget, there's two revenue streams for early college. One is the early college program line, which was 5 million last year. The governor's requested 10 million for it this year. That's the growth capital that allows programs to scale. It brings in technical assistance, professional development, everything they need to build a program and make sure it's high quality. And then the dual enrollment line item is what covers their college courses, because when they go over to North Shore Community College and they take a class, they're not getting tuition for that class. The state versus the college, those expenses. So that's the one that's going to actually grow the most in the coming years. As more and more kids enter early college programs and start to take more and more classes from the high school students. So your support for those two line items is really critical for the success of this initiative, because it's all sort of everybody trusting each other. The colleges or high schools are telling kids in ninth grade you're going to be able to take college courses when you're a junior or senior. They're getting them to sign up. The colleges are being told they're going to be reimbursed for these services after the fact. So it's really important that the money is in the state budget to make this happen. The other thing I think is important for the business community to really understand about how this program is operating is that for the first time ever, we're following the students and we're comparing them to peers who look identical to them to see if the program is actually having an impact and generating results. So you can see from these studies here that we've only been doing this for a few years, so we don't have a trail of the students all the way through college and into the workforce yet. We'll have that in a couple of years. But what we do have is immediate enrollment. Students who go directly from high school off college. And the early college students in the class of 2020, 63% of them went directly on to college without interruption, which is the highest predictor of success. If you go without upgrade, you're something like 5 times more likely to eventually complete. So it's a good sign that it's working. If you compare them to other students in Massachusetts, it's 43%, so there's a 20 percentage point gap, right? And historically, that's what we would do. We would show those two bars and say, this program is awesome. 20% more likely. But that kind of comparison has no statistical validity. It's not good practice to show people that kind of thing and claim success. You actually have to compare those students to others who look like them in every other way. And that's what the red bar is. That's our match comparison. So those students have the same MCAS scores, the same family income, the same race ethnicity, and English language skills. So it's not random assignment here, but it's close as you can get to sort of gold standard evidence-based research. And you can see you've got an 8 percentage point increase, which is still very significant. And we think it would be quite higher if it weren't for the pandemic, because if you looked at the class before this, the numbers were much better. There's no question that early college students have been disrupted by the pandemic, nowhere near to the same degree. It's insulated them some. But the point of all this is to show we're starting to track students for the very first time, so we can tell what works and invest in the things that actually deliver outcomes. Yeah. Yeah.
Talking about getting a college degree.
Yeah.
There's huge demand for trades right now, paying premium dollars. Where does that fit in?
Well, I think, early college is one pathway, right? There's no question that we need to have multiple pathways into strong careers for students in high schools. And vocational schools are the other pathway. We have more demand than we have right now. I mean, the business community and others have spent a lot of time working on vocational education. And we very much support that as well. And there's no question that early college students who are in these pathways may be getting a technical certificate that's short of a degree, but generates really large returns for them. We've done some research on that. And, I think there's a lot of need for that, and a lot of our community colleges are attuned to that and working with industry on what are the training programs that they want to see locally. We've spent a lot of time focusing on community colleges and community college pathways. That's what the majority of our students are going after high school. Now that we have these longitudinal data, we can follow the students through community colleges and see what their labor market outcomes are, whether they have a certificate, whether they have a degree, and if they don't complete, which is what happens to 2/3 of students who leave before earning anything. And you can see that when that happens, there's no labor market to them on what they spend on their courses, and there's no gains to the taxpayers for what they provide for that coursework. And that's what this chart shows. If you look at all of the students who graduated high school, they took the MCAS in 2008, so they graduated high school around 2010. We're looking at them now 7 years or 8 years later. What happened to that cohort? You can see the state spent about $60 million on their education, but only 1/3 of them completed. So we're just at the end of the chart, if you include all the state tax collections that we gained from the students who did complete and the avoided public costs, because there's less reliance on public benefits because they're more employed and they're earning higher wages. You know, when you pencil all that out, we're just about breaking even. They may be losing a few $1 million, you know, which isn't a great picture. If all those students had completed, the upside should have been $165 million. So those low completion rates are really problematic from a return on investment perspective for the state's community college. So early college is one solution to that. There's many other supports that we can provide community college students that have been shown to double chances that students will complete. And community colleges in the state are starting to adopt some of those evidence-based practices. But we've got a long way to go to make sure that our returns on investment in community colleges are realized. You know, part of it is because we're sending students with high needs to institutions that have very little resources to offer them. When you look at the net benefit of a community college degree for the state, it's something like $27,000 per completion. We're only spending about $12,000 now for a community college degree. So we could spend upwards of $16,000 more per degree and still break even. So I think one of the questions for us is how do we invest in these sorts of training opportunities in a way that maximizes success and return on investment for taxpayers? And again, all this stuff we couldn't do until the last year or two. We finally have data that follows students through colleges and into the workforce, so we can start to see what works, what pays off, what doesn't. We got to start to develop some discipline about using that kind of data to inform where our educational dollars go in Massachusetts, because we're spending quite a few of them. The last thing I wanted to say about education before I turn to housing, and this is related, is that many of the problems that we face in our cities are due to the concentration of poverty in our public school systems. This just shows this from the perspective of students of color. You look at Hispanic students in the average school, they attend 57% of the students are poor. With Black students, it's 54%, so more than half of their classmates are poor in the average schools. That means the majority of students of color in Massachusetts are concentrated in schools with very high levels of poverty. Almost all of our gateway city schools would be classified as a high poverty school. And the evidence is clear that if you attend a school with a high level of poverty, it's going to impact your educational outcomes in ways that are irreversible. We haven't done anything about the growing levels of poverty in our schools. It's not a matter that state policy takes up anymore. 20 years ago, we walked away from efforts to integrate schools because those battles had been so bruising. Nobody felt like they were being productive. That's not where we want to leave our cities. We want our cities to be diverse, socioeconomic, integrated communities. We don't want our schools to be places that only serve poor students. We want them to be the best that cities have to offer. A lot of people from all walks of life together and learn together, because that's how our global economy works today anyhow. So it's an incredible opportunity and advantage that our cities have. So we need to start thinking about how housing people and school people work together to build schools that are both racially, ethnically, and economically integrated. So just on the education policy priority front, again, I mentioned the urban college line items in the state budget we're working on now. I've mentioned several times the use of longitudinal data and making sure that we're asking decision makers to show us the results. And then lastly, thinking about this issue of integration. On the education side, early college is actually a strong model for bringing integration into classrooms because middle class families are definitely concerned about college costs, definitely want their students to have opportunities to take more challenging courses on our public university campuses. And so we've seen those schools attract all sorts of families. The other model that brings families together is through language immersion, where students learn foreign language at the same time, or they're a native speaker of a foreign language, they have the opportunity to learn and strengthen their native tongue at the same time as they acquire English. They have incredible results for English language learners, but they're also very strong cognitive benefits for children who learn a foreign language at a young age. Middle class families definitely appreciate that. We see them lining up to enroll in new language immersion schools, which you really need an immigrant population. You've got to have a mix of native English speakers of the second partner language that the school is providing. I know Lynn is working on new language immersion schools. I think there's lots of opportunities to position them as a design that brings about voluntary integration. So on the housing policy front, I'll just show you sort of what we see in the data, because the housing markets today are almost impossible to figure out. I'm sure you guys probably have as much insight on this question as I could possibly offer. But over the last decade, there's no question that we saw rent rising and gateway cities faster than we saw incomes rising. Home values were a little bit more suppressed relative to incomes in median gross rent. Of course, that's changed since the pandemic. This is just looking at a snapshot of what happened between 2010 and 2019, coming out of the Great Recession and all the impact that had on the housing market. And you see, I grouped this up into our 11 original gateway cities, which are cities outside of 495 and farther away from the Boston market, so Fall River, New Bedford, Springfield, Holyoke. And then this additional gateway cities, which is the cities within 128, mostly the Bureau, Chelsea, Salem, where the markets have definitely been stronger and the rent increases most noticeable. The other thing we see, this line is kind of hard to see. When you look at the share of home buyers in gateway cities by race and ethnicity, you can see that the share of white buyers in gateway cities has risen a little bit over the past decade. It's now about 22% of all of white buyers in Massachusetts are purchasing a home in a gateway city, which is just a little bit below the share of gateway cities as a share of the state's population. About 1 out of 4 Massachusetts residents lives in one of the state designated gateway cities. So just a little bit below that in terms of share of white home buyers. But when you look at residents of color in Massachusetts, a majority of them who are buying homes in gateway cities, and that's risen over the last decade, with the exception of Spanish buyers, which has Hispanic buyers, which declined a little bit. You can also see here, one thing we were concerned about is buyers of color in gateway cities purchasing in neighborhoods that were very unstable, where there still were significant foreclosures and significant numbers of vacant and abandoned properties. But that's actually declined, and so a larger share of buyers of color are now purchasing outside of these unstable areas in the gateway cities, and we're actually seeing an increase in white buyers who are purchasing in the less stable areas of gateway cities. So it's definitely a sign of gentrification that we're picking up in the home buying data there. And it's important to note that these, we think, are not speculators. These are mortgage originations to owner-occupied properties. So we're definitely seeing a pattern of white people returning and purchasing in gateway city neighborhoods just in the last 2 years. Also, we're seeing buyers of color purchasing more evenly throughout the gateway cities. So I think those are actually two healthy patterns. The other thing we've seen since the pandemic is the appreciation being strongest in the weakest neighborhoods. If you look prior to the pandemic, you were seeing home values rise in stronger neighborhoods and more suppressed in the neighborhoods where we still have those foreclosures that were lingering from the foreclosure crisis, abandoned homes that were stuck in probate and so forth. So but again, this is another sign of healthy market activity, which is very nice. This last chart, which is my favorite, unfortunately, rendering very well, shows the volume of new growth added to the tax base in gateway cities on a per capita basis over time. This is our way of tracking private residential investment. What's getting added to the tax rolls, and it's actually a good indicator because there's no lag and it's a real number. And you can see on a per capita basis, there's been a strong recovery in the additional gateway cities, up to about $1,100 per capita. We were down to a low of $729 per capita, but it's still less than half the per capita level of investment as there is statewide, and like 1/5 of what's being invested in Boston, and not where we were notably, in the early 2000s. There was twice that level of residential investment going on in gateway cities. So this is a big concern for us. The market is tightening, but we're not able to build it. And I think people who try to pencil projects out are still seeing gaps. Building costs have risen, the values haven't risen to the point where you can actually do the rehab work or build ground up construction in gateway cities. And so some projects are getting done on the sites that are easiest to work, but the more complicated, complex sites, we're not seeing the investment that we should, which is a challenge for the entire state's economy, because gateway cities are some of the very few communities that actually want to permit dense multifamily housing. But it's hard for them to make those projects work in the meet the demand. And I think that's largely where we're seeing those rent increases outpace income growth. So the things we're working on to address that is increasing the state's housing development incentive program, HDIP, which I think has only been used once in Lynn at this point. It's something we've been talking about for a decade now. It started off as a very small pilot program with just $5 million for the whole state each year, which nobody could do anything with. Governor Baker doubled it to $10 million, which people started to be able to do things with. But now there's 40 projects in a backlog, a 5-year wait to get any credit. The governor has tried to increase the program to $30 million annually. It didn't go through in the last economic development bill, but we're working really hard on this. We're really hopeful that we'll increase to $30 million this year. And part of the issue with this tool is when it's only so few dollars to go around for the entire state, they cap the amount that any individual project can get at $2 million. And as you guys know, a project nowadays is $40 to $60 million. $2 million in subsidy is not going to fill the gap, especially with construction costs rising to the extent that they have. So with $30 million a year, the cap could come way up to $5 or $6 million per project, which we hope would make a lot more work. This is a market rate housing production tool. It's very unique. It's unusual to subsidize market rate housing production, but it's what gateway cities have believed is appropriate to make sure that their housing stock is meeting the needs of all families and have socioeconomic diversity. We've been building subsidized project affordable income restricted housing in gateway cities for 40 years without seeing any market rate production. So the tool works well for communities that have demand for both market rate housing that isn't being met, as well as affordable housing that isn't being met. You can take a project, make it a mixed project by using our traditional affordable housing subsidies and marrying them with this tool to cover your market rates, which is something they've been doing in Boston for years and years, cross subsidizing the market or affordable units with market rate units because the market is so strong. In gateway cities, that math doesn't work, so you need a subsidy for both the market rate units and the affordable units, which this tool could and should provide, and has worked in a few instances in that way in Salem, most notably. So in addition to that, we've also been working in the neighborhood level to strengthen those neighborhoods where you still have blighted and abandoned homes left over, where you have triple decker stock that isn't being maintained and needs some upkeep. Last year, the legislature created a new program called the Neighborhood Stabilization Program. In the Economic Development Bill, it was capitalized with $50 million to give cities resources to buy these homes and fix them up and put them back in the market for affordable home ownership. So that was a bond bill, which means every year it has to be authorized. The program was authorized for $6.5 million this year. Mass Housing, which is running that program, just put an RFP out for communities who want those funds. We're hoping they'll put $10 million out in this coming fiscal year. We haven't had that resource in Massachusetts for a long time. It is an important tool for communities that have to be able to make sure they don't have problem properties that are catching fire and bringing down neighborhoods. So that's something that we've been working on. And then lastly, to go back to the school integration issue, I think there's a lot of interest in thinking about how we use housing in concert with school development and new school building projects to create economically integrated schools. We have lots of housing money that are coming from ARPA bills. We're going to be able to do creative things, pilot new approaches for the first time in a long while. Yeah. So we're hopeful that housing leaders and education leaders are going to sit at the table and come up with new strategies and ideas to build complete neighborhoods around a strong, high quality educational opportunity. And, especially in Lynn, as you see these new downtown buildings come up, and you have younger households come in, you want to make sure that you have an opportunity to keep them in the community as they start to outgrow that apartment. Thinking about what the townhouses you have and how they're across the street from a great school and how you sell that complete package is really important. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Is that for the net difference between purchase, recuperation, and then sale? And there's a net change.
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah. You hit that exactly right. It can also be used for other things, though. So, if you need money to acquire properties, use those dollars for acquisition. That's simple. If you have a neighborhood that has 10 problem properties, you want to purchase those and deal with them all at once. You can use it for acquisition that later. If you just want to do demolition, you can use those dollars to demolish those properties for green space, parking for them. If that's what the neighborhood. Or, like you said, Colin, often the property, somebody came in there, took all the copper and the wires out, and now it's going to cost more to fix it than sell it back. You can use that subsidy to cover that. It's a flexible tool to meet those needs that cities have. All right, I'm going to just finish up with digital equity and small business development. Quickly, just a couple of points on those two issues. Digital equity, I think we've learned a lot about in the pandemic. We're about to put out a report that shows that in Lynn, it's something like half of all households don't have broadband internet. If you look at the census data, which asks households if they have an internet plan, 17% of Lynn households are saying they don't have a plan. But an even larger share of Lynn households, almost a third, if you look at the speed test data, you can see the speeds that they're receiving in their house aren't up to the broadband standard, which is 25 megabits per second, which most people think is way below a household actually needs. If you have fiber, it's up in the hundreds. So that's a huge problem. We're trying to understand why that is. It could be that they're using a wireless signal in the building and everybody's sharing the same connection, and that's slowing everything down. But it could also be that the wiring in the building is 40 years old and you're working off a cable, coaxial cable that can't carry the signal any longer. So we've been working on this. The federal infrastructure bill has something like $500 million for improving broadband infrastructure in Massachusetts. The ARPA bill that the governor signed authorized $50 million. So there's going to be very significant amounts of money in cities to help them figure out this problem. This is an infrastructure problem, but it's way more than that. There's also a lot of households that just don't have digital skills, that don't have trust in internet companies, don't have the money to purchase internet plans. So there's a whole lot of work going on, reaching out to families, whether it's through schools, or through community health centers, or through workforce agencies, to help get them a laptop, to help get them on a discounted plan, make sure the technology they have is working and they know how to use it to meet their needs. And that's kind of the long-term issue because there's a whole lot of science that shows that kids don't have digital devices in their homes. They're not growing up on them. They're going to be so far behind their peers because we learn how to use these things. It's almost like language. Just acquire the skills by using it over and over through time. And the skills you build playing a video game can be used for you when it comes time to build a website, start a business, right? So having access to these technologies in early childhood is really important. And we definitely have a very strong divide between half and half. So we're looking at a new grant program to help each gateway city develop a comprehensive digital equity plan that addresses the infrastructure needs, but also the service delivery in the devices. We're looking at creating a digital equity fellows program that's actually modeled on the TDI program. So like you had, Joe, you would have a digital equity fellow in the team helping on this because we know that gateway city agencies are already strained, and giving them one more assignment, especially when they're trying to deploy so much money to address pandemic recovery issues would be challenging. So bringing in some support for that, and then looking at a commission to actually study how the state invests in broadband infrastructure. Up to this point, we've really depended on private internet service providers to develop policy for us as a Commonwealth, and they have very strong interests that have reduced competition and made it so most of our neighbor cities have only one provider. We've got to figure out a long-term solution to the marketplace. So we've been thinking about could we have an independent commission provide insight on that, and then also trying to figure out how cities procure devices. Having school departments, purchasing 20, 30,000 laptops every year is not a scalable, sustainable model. So the state actually needs a strategy for that long term. And then lastly, on the entrepreneurship, small business development piece, we did a report last year that showed the number of new starts in Massachusetts annually has dropped by more than half since the 2000s. And actually, this is a very long-term trend. There's obviously a lot of forces that play in terms of why people are starting businesses today. The marketplace is competitive. There's so much consolidation. There's definitely a big driver to that. And so electrification of the economy is certainly a huge contributing factor. We don't have all the blockbusters and all the record shops that we used to have. But there's also no question that as the economy becomes more diverse, if people of color are starting businesses at less than half the rate of white residents, we're going to see fewer business starts over time. And, there's lots of historical barriers that people of color face getting capital to start businesses. But there are also challenges they face building the business networks to get access to contracts and procurement. And that's the piece that we've been working on most recently. And we've been talking with your procurement officials about how you let RFPs and how you can use the city's purchasing to provide more opportunity to small local businesses owned by people of color. There's some legislation we've been working with the coalition of groups to develop that would provide more flexibility in state procurement law, because right now that there are in terms of how they're able to pay for goods and services, and especially for construction contracts. And that construction piece is what we're most concerned about, given that we're about to have a federal infrastructure bill with $10 billion of construction work coming to Massachusetts, plus all the other funded construction. It's kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity. We want to make sure that all businesses have the opportunity to participate in that economic activity. So the legislation covers those changes to the state procurement law that would give municipalities more freedom. It also includes some provisions that increase the transparency for institution spending. So hospitals and universities modeled on a California law. I think a lot of our gateway cities, there have been efforts to develop inclusive procurement initiatives that train small businesses and provide support to local small businesses so that the hospitals and universities are purchasing more locally. We'd like to see the numbers behind that because putting those numbers out creates a healthy competition and shows people who's being most successful, gives us a place to look for new ideas and strategies. And then lastly, the state has a small business technical assistance grant, which right now is about $7 million a year. We'd like to see it more around $10 million a year to provide the resources to community-based organizations that are supporting entrepreneurs and helping them get the professional services they need to get their books right, to apply for grants. That's all I had this morning. Really appreciate the opportunity and the invitation, Colin. We're often working on these things and coming to you all after the fact of support, but we really value hearing from you all about the policy change you'd like to see, research you'd like to see, working collaboratively, try and advocate for support for our big city partners.
One question. On the educational side, you're a licensed master plumber, which is about 5-6 years of training. And your starting wage would be $98,000 a year. And that's no college education, but a professional program. Where is the research in mapping not just college degree programs, but professional certificate or professional achievement programs that could be also comparable to the successful college?
Yeah, that's a good question, Colin. So, those vocational training programs have really strong research. First of all, kids are more successful in them because the learning is contextualized, they're doing something they like, they understand how it's going to benefit them in the future. So they're much more likely to be successful in high school and graduate if they have those opportunities. There's tons of research that shows that. But also to get back to my point about longitudinal data following students from school into the workforce, there was a study last year that looked at vocational students in Massachusetts, looked at their wages and control of their characteristics. It showed that there's no question that students who have those opportunities have higher wages and more success in the workforce. And so not a lot of that study hasn't seen a lot of daylight. For some reason, it was published in an academic journal, and I don't know why the state hasn't chosen to celebrate those results, because I think they provide a strong argument for increasing investment in programs right now. Along with this, I think there's a lot of concern that the students who most benefit from those vocational schools are the ones who are receiving admission in some cases. So there's coalitions that have formed to work on those issues. I think they've gained some ground, but we have clearly
That would be from the chamber. Career opportunities that we are including those metrics showcase how a professional trade-based program can also be a pathway.
And I would say just now that we have the data, right? We have data on what the wages are based on the course studies. So we should be talking to students earlier about, look, this is what this pathway would provide. And here's what your chance of success is, right? We have both of those numbers to show students. This is what share of students who start this program finish it, and this is what the students who finish it earn. And kids aren't seeing that, right? So who knows how to make that decision. If you look at community college students, for example, the largest chunk of that are going to community colleges and studying general studies or liberal arts. Well, there's no earnings gain from a liberal arts degree from a community college. So we've got to fix that. That is a huge money investment that's going down the drain. We've got to pay attention to the data and straighten things out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You can't find that information. That is the problem.
So it's out there, but it's always,
So this is where we are, right? The state has built these connections so that everything's integrated. The K through 12 data are connected to the college data, are connected to the wages through unemployment insurance filings. So you see what you're earning. But that's available to researchers. It's not available to the general public. The next step in the state is to actually build information systems where a student or a guidance counselor can get in there and see what wages are for graduates. You know, we passed a law a couple of years ago, Mass Business Alliance for Education, did all the advocacy mandating that the state create a website where students can see what the wages are by high school, by program. You know, hopefully we'll see that in the next year or two. Yeah. Yeah.
when they graduate, they still 2 years. So what we're finding.
Yeah.
Percentage of
Another struggle that protect kids have. We hear a lot about tuition reimbursement, scholarship, and all, but a lot of these kids need to come out and buy their to be in the field, and you know they scramble to come up with that. I think it's a lot. There's a same correlation. People want pictures have to or some shape, some that is seen as up there, right? So if we have the image that somewhat marketed tools are also taking plumber and nutrition, they're not looking at it more. Yeah, it's starting nutrition, but you're not doing you have to spend $30,000. You have to spend $100,000. Right? I guess the beauty of what we have failed to mention without the are very good, right? It's a really fast way to actually start making money, right? But you need to sell that you sell it up, right? Well, I think you touched on it. You know, you see it right across the street. The kids that are getting into vocational schools now, not necessarily the best kids to fit. And now the focus is go to trade school, especially in Lynn, because the numbers are managed there versus overcrowded classical and English. We have 40 plus different classrooms. By state regulation, you can't do that in vocational school. So everybody now wants the kids to go to Lynn Tech. They take them in based on grades. They kind of changed a little bit this year, but I still don't think it's working based on kids that get in there. They're the top kids. They're not getting into the high grades when they need. And kids who would be best suited for those programs can't get in because they didn't.
But I want to just comment. I don't think that it's necessarily needed. I don't know why we've come to this point that everyone goes to training so many years of education. I mean, let's face facts. In the past, individuals that went into the trade didn't go to college. They got out of high school. Some of them didn't finish high school, and they went into that because they were very good with what? With their hands and coordinating. Now, hence, we're in 2022, and now we're saying, okay, we're adding more hours for people who are going into the trade. That should change, in my opinion.
Caveat to that, you really don't have much to you really need to practice.
Right, that's what
Excellent.
you know, those are my thoughts, especially having a husband, and if I have my son, for example, he started college, and he decided, you know what, I don't really want to go to college. And we're like, okay, so what are you gonna do? Because obviously, all of us have taught our children, go to college, because that's where you're gonna need the money. But not every child is cut out to go to college. So I have a situation where my son, for example, we're like, okay, so what do you like to do? Now he's trying to figure out, what do I like to do? That's a very hard road of speaking with him and helping him with that. Like now he is at the post office, which is a trade. If you think about it, it's not behind a desk or and I think that those conversations should be happening in high school right from the beginning, like from the 9th grade, to help students and individuals uncover and what they're best at. And sometimes what you're best at isn't necessarily what is the best to go in as a trade too. So.
Well, let me do this because the vocational school is not my focus here. But the Mass Alliance for Vocational Education has a policy there. So let me get that to you so you can see what they're working on. I know it's very focused on expanding up the slots and the opportunities for kids to participate in programs. So let me see where they are on that. I'll get that policy. You guys have that. The other thing, the issue on the tools, though, I think is an interesting one. You know, there's lots of money for community development lending out there. I think a lot of organizations are working, looking at contractors in particular to support the growth of those businesses. I think they really struggle because those guys are on jobs all night long. But I think they're trying to figure out ways to meet them where they are so they can help them apply for loans to grow their businesses. The vocational piece. Well, in education, right, we've been really working on this advocacy and strategy on early college expansion because there's a step coalition that's really on vocational schools efforts. We support it, wholeheartedly agree that there's very significant economic development arguments. But that others are covering that, so we're kind of looking at areas where there's less advocacy activity.
I taught my 6-year-old grandson the game of life. He's been playing every week. And he never wants to go to college because he wants to work. He wants to make money now. So, yeah. But going back to the tuition reimbursement, too, I know my husband is an electrician. He had to do code class all the time. I mean, they should be able to get some of that. Yeah, every tree. They have to do continuing ed. When you graduate college, jobs. We have to do CDs, but you know, all of the trees have to do that.
I'm available as your staff. I'm in the real estate business.
Yeah.
Massachusetts does a terrific job, but job so we can't figure out, you know, what program is exactly appropriate for that. So you're going to go into a distressed community.
Yeah.
You don't want to buy a single family that's 1,040 around you.
Yeah.
So you want to buy 100. There's got to be sort of a simple repository. You know, this is the alphabet Super Bowl programs that are available by phone, by grants, by whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. We take those calls all the time.
Yeah. You should.
Developers who are trying to sort that out. And the state has tried to consolidate all those programs. I think they're continuing to do that. You know, more just in tasks. So we're happy to help anybody who has issues about you know, how does it work. Or I just want to do this is there anything that can help.
It's just about 9:30, so we're going to go one more question. And now we're going to thank Ben. Patrick.
I hope it's not too full. So you collect a lot of data, which is very useful. Advocate for policies. Are you advocating more at the legislative level, more at the agency level, combination? For example, we brought it up. There are 40 kids in the classroom. Is there any policy that would say we need to direct more resources, we need to take a disproportionate disproportionate percentage of students who are either English. I mean, it's really hard sitting, you know, in different settings. Here, oh, Wellesley's building a $200 million school, and Lynn can't get money to build a middle school. How's, you know, what's the equity?
Yeah. So, you know, I think you're all probably heard a little bit about the Student Opportunity Act, but we spent almost a decade fighting for the state to fairly fund schools. $2 billion under what should have been going to gateway schools was actually getting them. So that's why the classroom sizes got now the state's starting slowly to meet that obligation. So that we worked on that for a long time. I think that's important. But at the end of the day, most of that funding formula, the progressive nature of it, is based on the fact that gateway cities have such high levels of concentrated poverty, right? And that's not really sustainable on a good way of doing it. You've got to actually fix that problem at its roots and create more economic integration. You can't just give cities more money. Because, you know, we're only 20% of the vote, 25. And so over time, the suburbs get tired of sending so much money. There's an equity issue, but there's also a political dimension. Progressive formulas are only sustainable for so long. Inevitably, somebody finds a way to reach it. And so I wouldn't rely on progressive formula because one, it's not sustainable. Two, it never really fully compensates districts for the high levels of poverty they have. So our long-term solution has to be to have a stronger tax base so that gateway cities are self-sufficient. I think that's possible, you know, because there are real educational assets in these cities, whether it's the Voc school, which most suburban communities don't have, or the community college, which most suburban communities don't have, or a diverse set of students, so you can have those two language programs. You know, the child care providers you have in gateway cities are generally better than child care providers in suburban communities. I think there's a way to say, look, we have more than most other communities offer here. But it's hard to make that sell right now when the classrooms are so clouded and the classrooms have such high levels of need. Those resources, we've got to take them from the state and use them to address those problems in the near term, and then start to build more integrated environments that are more sustainable in the long run.
But I mean, part of the challenge is cities and towns have to sort of lobby for themselves, advocate for themselves. They're all pursuing a limited pool that will make decisions based on, you know, a presentation. So it's harder for us, a city like Lynn, to go to the school building authority advocating for middle school when they're competing against a higher standard of living community that's got more resources that can put on a better presentation. It's,
Yeah.
you know.
No, I agree with that. And the school building formula, we didn't address that with the student opportunity, right? And I think that we keep seeing gateway city projects go down because we just didn't have enough money to come up with this share. And so they aren't getting built in the suburban projects. So that needs to be addressed.
That's something
We're starting to think about that. Yeah, and I would address it in the context of, again, integration. If we're going to build these facilities, build the magnets that are actually population, maybe we need to start adding some responsibilities. Connecticut did that. They spent, I don't know, $3 billion on magnets in West Hartford and all around. And they're the most beautiful facilities you've ever seen. They're actually working. You see it in the mix of students, but also in the outcomes. So there are models for it. It was done right to ourselves. They had a court order that mandated them to do it. I think we could have a little bit of this right to do it. It's actually going to be the most effective way to spend our education. So we are working on it.
And just touch on one thing.
Yep.
Cities like Lynn, you get reimbursed by the MSBA at a higher
Yeah.
percentage rate than or affluent communities. It's just the affluent communities have the money to pick up their rent. Lynn doesn't have the money to pick up their rent, and that's why we lost those two middle schools. But, you know, you touched on disproportionate, and, you know, to be successful, we need to have a balance of housing and commercial. And then in that housing, a balance of market and affordable. And when it comes to our schools, a balance between enrollment in schools and the number of residents we have. And 17% of our population is enrolled in public schools. And that's not sustainable. And now we read the article in the paper yesterday, one of the survey, an exit survey for teachers to ask why they were all leaving. Well, you don't need a survey, you need open eyes that we've got such a high percentage of our population enrolled in the schools. The schools were overcrowded, they're crumbling, and the teachers are underpaid, and they're leaving to go to other communities. It's a problem.
You want to take a moment? Thank
Thank
Ben
you all.
for being here. Remember, we have our annual meeting next week. I hope all of you are going to be there. And keep a heads up for upcoming more breakfast meetings and everything else. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you soon.